Hi, Anna.
Hi, Sarah.
Uh, Today, my guest is Anna Clark. She is a prolific freelance journalist, and in particular, that she's currently the political media correspondent for the Columbia Journalism Review. And today, we're going to be talking about political media. So, I'm very excited to have you with me today.
Thank you.
So, let's talk first about progressive media, and in particular, a couple of progressive media outlets that have been in the news lately, one for financial trouble and one for sort of sudden and mysterious and surprising firing of its entire editorial staff. And I'll just, full disclosure here, one of the outlet that was having financial trouble is the American Prospect, which I have been a regular contributor to for a long time. And the other one is Good Magazine, whose editor-in-chief was actually one of my editors at the American Prospect, Anne Friedman. And Anne has been very involved in one of the other topics we're going to talk about today, which is closing the gender byline gap. But let's, do you think that what has been happening at the Prospect, they were having financial trouble. It seems like they've raised a lot of money since they sent out a call for help to save it. And then at Good, what happened was basically the entire editorial staff got fired, and the owners of the magazine, which is sort of geared towards this do-goody, saving the world sort of perspective, decided that they didn't really want to have a magazine anymore, and they just wanted to have some sort of, unclear to me, social media platform. But do you think that these two things say anything bigger than just trouble at those two magazines about the state of progressive media at the moment?
I think it's fascinating to compare these two, because it's amazing that they're happening at the same time, because it puts the lie that the only problem with media and political media in particular is profits, is being able to make money. Good's doing its overhaul, right? and it even though it was being very profitable and getting a lot of critical acclaim, and was in a position that I think a lot of other publications would envy, and still they made this decision and seem to be in a point of upheaval and haven't made clear exactly why they decided to move into this space. And the American Prospect has a more perhaps easily understood uncertainty with money, but together I think the two show that I think a lot of people just have no idea what they want to do. And that's not just the people who are behind the publications, but readers, like people don't seem to quite know what they want and seem very hesitant to take risks or support media they like, because the uncertainty is there whether or not, profits are there, whether or not people are able to support that work.
Right, so is the uncertainty, I think though that the Prospect, the fact that the American Prospect got this huge influx of donations when it said, if we don't raise X amount of money by the end of May, we're going to basically shut our doors. Do you think that demonstrated that there are a sufficient number of readers who want to save a publication like that, but does it indicate that there's a sufficient number of readers who want to sustain a publication like that when it's not in a crisis?
I'm very heartened by how many people, took up arms to support the American Prospect, both, financially and spreading the word and all that. And I have a soft spot for it, because it was one of the, first publications that I was published things I wrote, and I,
me too.
The American Prospect, besides having, a history of doing really interesting and very solid journalism, has a history of taking chances on young writers, or inexperienced writers that they're able to work with and partner together. And I think that's really phenomenal. That's something I think a lot of people don't want to see lost.
And not just their staff writers and their writing fellows program, which has produced a lot of great journalists, but also they have that approach to freelancers too. And you know, like you and I have been published there. And I had my first long form investigative print magazine piece published in the American Prospect. So yeah, I agree with you. But I think that it has had a little bit of a, it's gone through slightly different iterations, and I think that it has done great investigative pieces, and it's also done great kind of policy wonky stuff, which is, I think it's a little bit more known for. But do you think that its readership or the public, you know, the news consuming public that would be potentially drawn to a magazine like that, do you think that I think that they're clearly getting, you know, clearly stating this is what we're about. We're about writing about policy, or we're about doing investigative journalism, or we're about both of those things? Or do you think it's clearly laid out for people?
I think yes. I think audiences are drawn to, you know, strong investigative pieces and policy stories because they're important. These things actually affect our lives, you know, unlike, which I think we're going to talk about later too, about like the you know, political journalism that orients itself around gaffe checks, you know. I mean, people realize that policies, stories about policies are the stories that actually will impact their lives. And what does seem to be something that I think the American Prospect is challenged by is, like, by being a progressively oriented policy publication, there seems to be this larger trend in progressive media where people seem less willing to support media, to prioritize media for their subscriptions or their donations or what have you, compared to their conservative counterparts, you know? And I think I speculated for years about, like, why this is, you know, but it just seems to be a pattern, right? Like you know, like Air America, a lot of other media sources that people try to put out there as some sort of late entry opposition to conservative policy publications, and they unfailingly struggle, even though a lot of its readers care about it, want it to be there, support it. And yet, you know, and not just readers too, but like a lot of the foundation support and think tank support that, like, also helps keeps a lot of these kind of publications afloat. Like, for some reason, media does not end up being a priority for the way I think a lot of progressive intellectuals want to spend their money.
Right. And are you talking about big money donors or small money individual donors, or both? Both,
really. You know, like, I think a lot of folks, my speculation is that I think a lot of these, like, their target audience, a lot of these progressive readers, know that media is important, of course know that media is important, and consume media and think critically about media. And yet when it comes to, like, where they're going to, you know, put a finite amount of their dollars for donations or subscriptions or you know, large support. I think a lot of folks choose organizations or outlets that have something that feels more concrete and tangible than media, which is just by nature a little bit more nebulous. It is, you know, but we know what matters, and so it's a problem when we start seeing these things like slipping into the black hole that I hope with all my heart that the American Prospect isn't headed into.
Right. Wait, do you think that now, with the rise of the super PACs and the dark money, do you think the impulse of big money donors who are progressives will be towards, oh, well, we've got to fight the super PACs, so I'm going to pour money into our super PACs?
Maybe.
To fight the conservative super PACs. And
yeah, I mean, like, I think this is kind of a challenge, right? Like people keep being lured into playing that like reactionary game of trying, like, if somebody's putting their money in one place, like, I think their political opponents, you know, like, feel like they need to go there as well to push back and play that same game, you know, which is a little frustrating because one might imagine alternative ways of trying to make a difference and create the kind of world of, you know, good journalism and good politics that we'd all like to live in.
Well, speaking of that, so what about Good Magazine?
Good Magazine, good segue.
do you know anything about what was behind the owner's decision that they didn't want? They've been very vague about it. I think one of your CJR colleagues wrote about this, that they had, oh, well, maybe we want to make it we want to be able to gamify our content and create some sort of platform for people to, I don't know, it sounded kind of vague and uncertain to me, but that they just wanted to get rid of the actual journalism component of it and make it more of a place for people to congregate online.
I feel really skeptical. I do. I mean, like, it seems an misfortune of timing, like for those who are still with Good and trying to lead this transition, in that they got rid of an editorial staff that was very talented and very well respected and well liked by readers and colleagues and all that. And those are the headlines, and yet they don't have any. They've articulated that they're not in a place yet to announce exactly what they're going to do. So we have just these generalizations, and
it just seems weird.
Yeah, we're not really in a position to be like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, because we don't know what their idea is. We don't know, and we just see what we lost, and it's really unfortunate.
Yeah. So, but it wasn't because they didn't have money to pay the staff, which I think is sort of I think that's our stereotype of the problem with progressive media, is that they're always scraping around for money, but that was not the case here.
It wasn't the case, because they did a great job with they were able to, like, what I think was interesting about Good, I mean, and I've had my issues with some of the things they've written, but overall I do appreciate that they're able to put together a publication that gave a lot of different kinds of readers entry. Its content was substantial and yet broad enough that I think a lot of different people were drawn to it. Its audience was
very
diverse and engaged too. They're able to really engage their readers in both their print and their online platforms, and their design and their graphics is something that they prioritized, unlike I think a lot of other publications, and that was wonderful. Like they were able to, like, speak both through their writing and their infographics and their design, and they're able to communicate really well to a lot of different kinds of people. So I think it's terrible that they're gone. And I mean, of course, I'm interested in whatever kind of new platform that they put together. I like games, like I'm intrigued by the possibilities of games for social good and all that. I'm surprised and disappointed that the folks who are at the magazine still, if we can call it a magazine, seem to think that they can either do that or have their content, and seem to not be able to imagine them coexisting. And I think that's too bad, because I don't believe that's true.
Oh, that's interesting. So you think that those two things that journalism and activism, basically, or a platform for people to interact with each other for the purpose of social activism, can coexist in the same, really not the same publication or same space.
Yeah, I do, and I feel like, I mean, the reason I was drawn to their space was because I was interested in the things that people wrote. I mean, I think, I don't know, like I feel, of course, there's room for innovations and experiment, but I do feel like there is a bit of a wariness with sort of online platform exhaustion. For a lot of us out there. There's a lot of different places to engage, and a lot of digital outlets that want us to, sign up and do digital activism and all these various things. And they're important, they're good, and we make choices about where we want to prioritize our time. I would be interested if Good, instead of trying to, put their own spin on some kind of replication of these, like, online activism platforms, were instead experimented with how it could coexist with magazine journalism, which is good and important. Like, information matters, ideas matter, and the voices that they elevate in their magazine matter. And I'm not sure why people will be drawn to the platform they're going to create without the journalism that's there, Like, I'm not sure why people will choose them among all the other platforms out there if what they don't have going for them anymore is their editorial staff.
Right.
I don't know.
It seems to me, though, that the editorial side could exist without this online social platform side.
Yeah.
And I actually sort of prefer a model where there's a magazine that's, leaves it to the reader to decide what sort of activism they want to engage in, as opposed to tying the two together. Like, oh, we just reported this story and you should take action on it because, we reported about some terrible environmental disaster and you should call on Congress to investigate it, or whatever the thing is. I don't, that's kind of a crappy example, but I kind of feel, I don't know, I have a little bit of I'm not thrilled with that sort of model. I prefer a model that, I just think, this is my preference. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it, and I think that kind of platform does bring a lot of people into the political world and political activism and thinking about issues and thinking about how they can engage in politics. And so I think that's a good thing. But as a journalist, I kind of don't love that model because I think I tend to think of those things as separate.
Do you feel like it would, if you had an article that was followed up by some kind of, here's how you can get involved thing or whatever, do you think it would sort of coat your article in this sort of lacquer of propaganda or PR material, even if it's like a really great article? You know what I mean? Like, do you think it would kind of like cheapen it somehow or lessen its worth?
I don't think it cheapens it or lessens its worth. But I kind of feel like, as a reader, I like to draw my own conclusions from things. And maybe I'm a more engaged reader than, maybe other readers, read an article and they're like, gee, I really wish I could do something about that, but I don't know what to do, right? I don't know who to write a letter to, or where to sign a petition, or who to approach, in government, or elected officials to change this terrible thing that I just read about, right? And so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's a good thing to have that sort of journalism and activism tied together, because people would feel like they're at a loss after reading something that demonstrates to them some terrible injustice, and they really would like to do something about it to the extent that individual citizens can. And but I as a reader, I kind of get annoyed when I read something and then it says, take action on this. But maybe other readers don't, I don't know. I mean, I kind of have a reaction. Don't tell me what to do.
And I think, honestly, I think that's a little bit of, a symptom of progressivism, and I feel it too, that sort of sense of, like willful independence and making sure at all times that we're trying to make our own decisions as best we can. And I think I heard somewhere on a radio report that was comparing how talking points are used in Republican versus Democratic points, or camps, and that I heard that the Republicans very effectively, disseminate talking points and people stick to them and they affirm them, and to the point where they seem to have the solidity of facts, whereas their Democratic counterparts would often people would go off script for better and worse, and it was a lot more fractured of a system. And the reason why, according to the Democratic Insider that this radio report was interviewing, was that nobody wants to feel like they're taking orders. You know what I mean? Nobody wants to feel like their ideas are not their own. They don't want to follow some script. They want to feel independent, even when they're affiliated with the party and support the things that are said. And I think that's. That sort of instinct we all have to ensure our own self-governance and independence of thought. I think that contributes to the lack of support for progressive political media.
Oh, that's interesting. But do you think that the social media revolution could change that?
I don't know. I mean, it certainly changes things. It changes the landscape. It gives people an opportunity to have what they at least imagine, if not actually is, like their independent voice, and, can feel like they're, moving with ease among, different things that they support, and aren't feeling like they're part of some,
Right.
some mass, where we feel like we lose our own, thoughts and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how that would translate into support for like institutions of media, like for magazines, for things like the American and Prospect. I want them to. And I think the social media certainly has contributed to how the American Prospect has very impressively, raised a lot of money in a short amount of time, because people are able to spread the word, and that's important. So I can see these things like coexisting and working together.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Like I feel like they're like conversations like this, I hope, and other kinds of conversations. I think there just needs to be more talk about like why media matters, and if we want media, the kind of media that we want to exist, we need to support it. We are getting in this space where people sort of assume that media should and will be free. There's that kind of like tagline, like information wants to be free and all this. I believe in accessible information. I also believe that like good journalism takes money, and it's worth it. It is worth it.
Yes, reporters need to be paid, and it costs a lot of money to travel to wherever you need to do your reporting, and it's expensive, and people, you need to understand that it costs money, mm-hmm. and that that people aren't that journalists aren't doing this a labor of love. It's their vocation. It's the way they make a living.
Mm-hmm. They do, and it's sort of, I bristle at this, and I of course I take it personally as somebody's trying to make her life as a freelance writer, but like I bristle at this idea that like that writers should work for free, or for for pittances, and that it's not, which seems to translate into either it's not that important or you don't love what you're doing. You know what I mean? And neither of those things are true. And as a media consumer, like I'm as much a reader as a writer, and I feel like like I'm very aware that if the publications that I think matter, that I want to be there, that I think do good work, that I enjoy reading, like if I'm not willing to pay for it, I shouldn't assume other people are going to do it so I can read it for free. You know what I mean? It's just, I feel like just it's part of the public good for us to support the media that we believe is doing worthwhile work, because mm-hmm. it sounds old fashioned, but it is at its best it is our watchdog, right? We do need it, and I don't think free media outlets and social media, as important as it is, as effective as it is in some ways, is a complete replacement for what real reported journalism is. Right.
Well, the whole question of monetizing it and what sorts of setups are profitable and all of that is probably a different conversation. But let's segue into the coverage of the presidential campaign, which is a frustrating topic in and of itself, and something that you write about at CJR. Mm-hmm. And I have covered the campaign and written about the campaign. So overall, how would you rate the coverage of the presidential campaign so far? We're sort of in this weird lull right now that Romney has clinched the Republican nomination, and it's before the conventions, and it's before he picks a running mate, and it's summer, and we're almost summer, so we're in this weird lull where there's a lot of even dumber
it's true. There's no other word for it. It's absolutely true. Yeah, this is like the time where the reporters covering the election have no idea what to write about.
Right.
So they'll write about anything and inflate its importance. And
well, let's give some examples of that. Okay, so this week, or late last week, I guess, Obama, this was called a gaffe. So I want an entirely new, redefinition, reconstitution of what the word gaffe means, right? So he said what was the exact phrase? The private sector is doing just fine. Mm-hmm. And of course, what he meant was, people who work for this bank CEOs and other people in positions like that, positions of power on Wall Street and so forth, are doing fine. he didn't mean that, for example, the thing that John McCain said in 2008, that the fundamentals of the economy were strong when the global economy was about to implode. But, then of course it becomes a thing, right? And so then you see columns written, so like Chris Cillizza at the Post, and not to pick on the Post, but Dana Milbank had a piece about what a terrible week Obama had, and one thing had to do with the fact that he had said this terrible, horrible thing that of course everybody should interpret the same way, and that his Commerce Secretary had this terrible accident when it turned out that he has some sort of terrible medical condition that caused it. He had a seizure. But of course, that became this thing at the White House press briefing, and because it gave political writers something to talk about when there wasn't really anything to talk about. I mean, it's like,
it's amazing, isn't it? Like, I mean, how do you feel that? Why do you feel that even when there are plenty of important stories that need some amount of time and investigation to report well, especially given our new how money is influencing elections. The presidential election for the very first time. There's all kinds of important stories that could use more time and attention. And now, in this particular point in the campaign year, is when these election journalists, political journalists, have more time to do these kind of investigations. Why do you feel like it's not happening and that folks are settling for the gaffe?
Well, I think the gaffe thing persists throughout the campaign, no matter what stage it's at. And so, I remember I was, and of course, I'm sure I've written my share of dumb political stories, just to be totally honest. But, I think that there's a sense in our political media culture that even though it's totally wrong and disproved by history, that there's this one moment where everyone wants to write a book where the moment that an article, that was the moment that turned the election. And so will it be the moment that Obama said the private sector is doing just fine? Or and I remember I was in Iowa in August, and I was at the campaign event when Romney said, "Corporations are people, my friend." And you definitely had this sense, it was outside, it was at the Iowa State Fair. And as soon as he said it, all the political reporters who were there and the small number of members of the who were there, so you immediately, it was like everybody's hair stood up on the back of their neck, and and then everybody started tweeting, and there were reporters sitting on bales of hay trying to file a blog post from there.
Everyone wants to break the story that they're all there for.
Break the story that he said this incredibly stupid, unself-aware thing. But, he of course did go on to explain that, that corporations give people jobs and da-da-da-da-da. But of course, for the ultra-rich Bain capital Mitt Romney to say that, of course, it seemed really dumb and out of touch. But so at the time, people thought, well, this is going to be the thing that defines the campaign. It's going to show that that Romney thinks that corporations are people and how out of touch he is with regular people. And what do you know? It seems like we have forgotten about that gaffe, and we're on to a new gaffe. Now we're we're discussing whether Romney puts an S on the end of sport, whether he talks about sport or sports, and and all sorts of things like that.
It's amazing. It doesn't even matter. Isn't it amazing that we spend this much attention on these things that really, really don't matter that much? It does seem to conflate into politics as entertainment, right? It's like turning the candidates into sort of sitcom characters, and we all laugh when they do things that seem funny, and we're just watching the show.
It's almost like the TV recap phenomenon where every site has the recap of Girls and Mad Men.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to dissect what's in Lena Dunham's mind or Matt Weiner's mind, and we sort of apply that sort of same, and it's as if the presidential campaign is a TV show that's entertaining us, as opposed to who's going to lead the country in this time when the economy is clearly still in trouble. We really need to do something about regulating Wall Street still, 4 years later. The climate change, the environment. I mean, there are these possibly catastrophic things facing the country and the world. And we're obsessing about gaffes. But at some point, I think that there's such an obsession with the gaffes of the politicians, broadly defined, and picking away at finding out more about their past and their history. And surely their record as elected officials is obviously relevant and should be picked away at. But at some point, the picking away has to lead to something of relevance, not just. There's got to be a connection made. I'm not saying that hasn't been good picking away at Romney's record in Massachusetts and the lies that he seems given to make about healthcare reform and so on in his past record. But I just don't think that I don't think that we're getting a lot of that sort of coverage. Obviously there are people who are doing it, but I don't think in the mainstream media we're getting a ton of that.
I love how you made the connection to episode recaps. I think that really resonates. I feel like one of the things that I've been, particularly noticing, like in this new CGR role and examining a lot of political media coverage, is that a lot of the stories, even about issues that have a little bit more substance to them, about something that happened or a proposal or some such thing. A lot of the reporters are, the sources will be various political media strategists, and spokesmen for the campaign, and usually spokesmen's. They who will banter about, this is how I think this will affect the campaign, and I think this will contribute to the narrative, and it's all strategy talk, right? Even when we have an opportunity to talk about an issue of substance, and what troubles me about this is that it seems a little bit like an episode recap. Like people are just trying to figure out what's going to happen next. What are the themes? And
what does it
those
mean
are interesting things to talk about sometimes. But it does literally erase the fact that that the election matters because of actual people's lives and how it will affect them. We're not actually talking to too many people on the ground who are living the impacts of policies or non-policies. There's not that much of talking to them as sources, and instead it's all just strategy talk, which matters, but when it completely overtakes a perspective that centers the fact that this election matters because of how it affects our natural world and human lives, I think we're in trouble. I think we've gotten very myopic.
To cycle back to the opening part of this conversation, I haven't read it yet, but the American Prospect's new issue is about poverty. So,
and that matters. That's important, and I'm glad they're doing that.
Right, exactly, and which is why we need media like that. But yeah, I think that as something I also wanted to talk about in regard to coverage of the presidential campaign is a pet peeve of mine, because I write about religion, and that coverage of the candidate's religion, particularly this time around, because so many reporters are mystified by Mormonism and sort of unclear about Obama's still unclear about Obama's religious views and religious background. That I often find coverage of the candidate's religion really dissatisfying. I think there was an article in the Times a week or two ago about how Romney's Mormonism would affect his presidency, and I think it's sort of an odd approach, I think, because I mean, I think if you had an Episcopalian candidate, would there be an article about how his Episcopalianism? I think most of of all religious denominations, I think we've had the most Episcopalian presidents. But would there be an article about how so-and-so candidate's Episcopalianism would impact his presidency? I don't.
It seems like Episcopalian's kind of conflated with like normal, so it's not news, right?
Right. But we don't really know what pieces of Romney what pieces of public Romney are impacted by his Mormonism per se, his religious beliefs, as opposed to the culture in which he grew up and continues to live in Mormon culture, or his family life, which may not necessarily, I mean, there's not a direct line. For very few people, there's a direct line like, oh, well, this religious belief leads me to this or leads me to act this way. I mean, people are more complex than that, or at least I hope Romney is more complex than that. And so I find it frustrating because I think that in politics, the more relevant question to ask is not how the candidate's religion will lead from point A to point B, but how the candidate's political allies or needed political constituencies, i.e. needed to win elections or form coalitions to get certain legislation passed or whatever it is, that is more relevant to how they're going to get from point A to point B on some policy question. And I think that there's a sort of mixing up of those things in a weird way that leads to some of these discussions about the religion leading from point A to point B, which sort of bothers me.
So it seems like like you're saying that there's one of the trouble with how political media writers are covering religion, particularly Romney's Mormonism, is that just a misunderstanding or simplification for how religion affects people's decisions, and avoiding the story or sidestepping the story in some way of the other ways that his religion will impact how he is as a candidate and how he works as a candidate. Do you also see that? Do you see fundamental misunderstandings of Mormonism in particular, or in the case of Obama, Christianity and Islam in particular? I mean, do you see?
Well, yeah.
How is that showing up in some of the political media of the candidates?
Well, I think that with Mormonism, there's been a lot of coverage that discusses Mormonism in a kind of, I'm not sure how to describe it, that focuses on the quote unquote weird things about Mormon theology. Now, any religion is going to have things that are going to seem weird to outsiders.
Right.
And that's, and religious belief is not rational. And we don't have, constitutionally, we don't have a religious test for president. And so he is allowed to have weird religious beliefs. Now, there are questions raised, I think, and I've written about this, that so he served as a bishop, as a lay bishop, because that's how the LDS church works. They have lay clergy in his ward and stake in Boston. And he was confronted by Mormon feminists about, patriarchal rules and requirements and so on in the church. And I think those sorts of questions are relevant because they impact public policy. But I think people are interested in the weirdness, the undergarments that devout Mormons wear, or the different aspects of Mormon theology and belief that seem weird, planets and plural marriage and, things like that. But then on the other hand, so when Romney starts to talk about things like, well, marriage is between one man and a woman and traditional marriage and blah, 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 he ignores the fact that his own religious denomination had in the past said that polygamy was okay. So as a historical matter, not as a theological matter, but as a historical matter, him saying that traditional marriage means that it's always been between one man and one woman is not, he should know that that's kind of bullshit.
Yeah. That would have been fascinating if he's like specifically articulated it, even if it was like his own dissent, from that historical platform. It would have been fascinating if he had like explicitly cited the alternative marriage espoused in the Mormon Church in his comments about the policy of contemporary versions of alternative marriages and how the policy implications of them. That would have been amazing. That's really interesting.
Well, I think that he wants, on the one hand, to run from this association between Mormonism and polygamy, which, is historical, but has been, disavowed, right? So it's like anti-Mormon bigotry is kind of still present and causes people to say, do these Mormons still believe in polygamy, even though they say they don't? Mm-hmm. And so he really wants to distance himself from that and play to the religious right base, which is against same-sex marriage. And so in doing that, he sort of boxed himself into this weird corner where he's, pounding his fist on the table about marriage historically being traditional marriage between one man and one woman, when his own tradition clearly shows that historically that's not true. But so
it seems
it's always a difficult line, the place where it's okay to probe a candidate's faith, and it's something I think about a lot and write about a lot. But so I think that there are places where it's legitimate to ask him about certain things, but like I said, sort of the weird theology stuff is off limits. Now, with regard to Obama, the fact that there's still some huge segment of the Republican base that thinks he's a Muslim or might be a Muslim or some crypto-Muslim, and thinks that even if they think that he does call himself a Christian, they don't think it's quote-unquote real Christianity because he belonged to a denomination that was lefty and went to a church where Jeremiah Wright was the pastor. And I think it just shows that there's this, that for a big part of the Republican base, there's this one definition of what true Christianity is, and that candidates have to comply with it now, whether or be a part of that. But on the other hand, it sort of seems like these same people have made a concession that, okay, well, we'll still vote for Romney, even though we don't think Mormonism fits within that frame, because whatever Obama is worse than voting for a Mormon.
Is this unprecedented that the two leading major party political candidates, presidential candidates, are both being othered for their religion? I mean, that seems really unusual.
Mm-hmm. Because I think that this is, Obama is a Protestant. Mm-hmm. So there's never been a campaign where one of the two-party candidates was not a Protestant. But this is a weird or unprecedented situation because Obama's Protestantism is not even acknowledged or accepted by a good part of the conservative space.
I think that's really interesting. It seems like, I don't know, you by far would know more than me, but it seems like in historical presidential religion so-called controversies, like the worry was that people were like too much of a believer in whatever belief they espouse, which I guess might rhyme a little bit with what's going on with the Romney coverage. So like JFK's Catholicism, people are worried that he's too Catholic, and they'll take, orders from the Pope or whatever. And I think Nixon being a Quaker, like people are worried, like then you'll be too Quakerish, and the worry is that you believe the religion, you believe wholeheartedly, perhaps too much of whatever religion that you affiliate yourself with. And it's interesting. I mean, that seems to be replicated in people's fears about Romney, but with Obama, that's really interesting that people are like, actually, I believe you are too little affiliated with the religion that you're espousing,
or
and
that
I think
you're
it's actually
affiliated
something else.
with a suspect religion.
Yeah, that's a really interesting variation on what seems to be the pattern in suspicion about candidate religion.
So let's just to close out. I wanted to talk with you briefly, I guess, at this point, about your colleague Erica Fry a couple weeks ago had a really good piece in CJR about the byline gender gap in the opinion pages of, I think she looked at major newspapers and magazines. I can't remember if it was magazines too, but I think it was just the opinion pages of newspapers, and that women were more likely to have stories about family life and so on. Well, first of all, there was just a byline gender gap that, far more male bylines than female bylines, but also that women were more likely to have pieces published that were about sort of these soft family lifestyle sorts of topics, whereas men were far more likely to have stories published about the quote unquote harder topics of the economy or foreign policy and things like that. I feel like we've been having, not you and I, but just the global we, have been having this conversation about the byline gender gap forever. I mean, not just on the opinion pages, but just in general in magazines and even in progressive magazines. What do you think it's going to take to get to a place where we're not having this conversation anymore? Yeah,
I mean, it's such an important conversation, and I'm sure you two are, like me, are completely exhausted by it, just because it comes up again and again and again, and we know this is a problem. And I think Erica Fry talked about this in a great article. Like this has been a persistent problem, and people will see it articulated in for example the Vita numbers or the Fourth Estate numbers, or the years ago there was a blog called I think Women TK, very clever, where it was an editor who did, similar kinds of accounts and just put them out there sort of without comment, but they spoke for themselves. And we see this again, all over again, and then we get, outraged at the disparities that it speaks of. We talk about various kinds of solutions, and then things quiet down for a while, and then the same thing kind of happens again. And so I think it's the pattern speaks for itself, that we need to take some kind of left turn. We need to take some kind of active step instead of waiting for things to change, because or feeling that a few nuanced statements of, yes, we accept all kinds of people. We think diversity is important in our the representations of our op-ed pages, but it takes journalists and editors taking affirmative action, to use a somewhat loaded phrase to change these things. I mean, I do think there's a lot to be said about female writers or other underrepresented writers to amp up their persistence, and I think sometimes that kind of personal responsibility is some of the issue, but it's certainly not all of the issue, and I think it's naive to think so. And I think you mentioned Anne Friedman before, who has proved, that taking this kind of affirmative action, seeking out great writers that you think should be on your pages to have a more complete representation of the kind of experiences and opinions folks have in this country works. It works, at both American Prospect and at Good. Those were publications that had far less shocking numbers, and I think the issue about what these women writers are writing about is also very fascinating. I was actually intrigued that yes, women are far more likely to be writing about these like so-called softer topics about family and so on. But I was interested that it wasn't even by that much, you know, like it was like, I think the number she had in the article was like 53%, you know, of the op-eds were about these, you know, softer topics or so on, were like women. It wasn't even that much, you know, like these are supposedly, you know, what females are left with as, you know, to write about in terms of their expertise, and that's troubling. And Fourth Estate also came out with, like, you know, the gender gap in sources, you know, who these journalists are turning to, you know, and you know, and it's wildly, you know, off again, even about topics that are very explicitly about women's experience, you know, and some of this has to do with like who's in charge of certain kinds of organizations and so on, and you do need to include their voices, and they do tend to be men, and yet, you know, like I do think it's like a journalist's responsibility to like notice, you know, when things are askew and to take the affirmative action, to go look for like people who can speak from a more personal way about their experience. I think it's up to editors to like take some action to like reach out to people that they should be on the pages. It does take a little bit more work, but it is important and it is worth it, you know, if we're going to have meaningful and effective media out there. It's not just about like some kind of arbitrary account so it looks good on paper. It's like it actually, you know, it actually connects to the substance of what is on the pages. And if you want a better substance, you do need to have men and women and people from multiple ethnicities and racial backgrounds. You do need to, because in the kind of society we live in, we have very different experiences. And like either those are, you represent the multiplicity of experiences in this country, or you do not. And if you do not, you have an artificial representation of this country.
Yeah, that's right.
I feel like I should bang the table right now.
Thanks a lot for talking with me today.
Oh, thank you. This is fun. This is great. You have a wonderful format.
Thanks. Okay.